American Federation of Teachers President Randi Weingarten gave an impassioned speech outside the Supreme Court steps yesterday as the justices heard challenges to President Biden's student loan debt forgiveness plan. Let's watch.
President Biden said, we are going to deal with that. As we deal with the end of the pandemic, we're going to deal with that. We're not going to start student debt again without actually making a down payment of it. And the Secretary of Education had the right to do it. And frankly, and this is what really pisses me off, during the pandemic, we understood that small businesses were hurting, and we helped them, and it didn't go to the Supreme Court to challenge it. Big businesses were hurting, and we helped them, and it didn't go to the Supreme Court to challenge it. All of a sudden, when it's about our students, they challenge it, the corporations challenge it, the student loan lenders challenge it. That is not right, that is not fair, and that is what we are fighting as well when we say cancel student debt.
I think that was a little unfair, that point. I mean, you can say we shouldn't have given that, or that it's not fair that businesses get the aid and students don't, but the reason it's before the Supreme Court is Congress passed a law to give businesses, and President Biden just declared this. That's why it's before the Supreme Court.
The argument that's you're assuming the conclusion there. The argument that's being made before the Supreme Court by the Solicitor General is that Biden has authority under several acts. He's chosen to use the HEROES Act, also under the Higher Education Act, to, in times of emergency, cancel student debt. It's been done before, and it's the exact same authority that Donald Trump used to suspend student loan payments during the pandemic. The reason it's being in court right now is not because it wasn't passed by a law, but it was passed by executive order. It's because it was challenged in a way that the PPP loans and other kinds of debt relief weren't challenged. And the very question in this case, and the reason why there is a strong possibility that it will be dismissed and the student debt policy, the student debt policy will go through, is because the standing claim is so weak and so attenuated. So it's a claim that's being made on behalf of a servicer who themselves doesn't want to make a claim, many people believe, because they profit heartily from having these government contracts and don't want to miss out on its servicing contracts by suing the government, basically, that gives it all of its money. And that very standing issue is likely why it could potentially fail. It's the weakest part of the case.
Congress passed a law in the midst of the pandemic to give aid to businesses, et cetera, clearly, which I'm not even a huge fan of, as I made clear, but so that didn't get challenged. The Biden administration has argued that a 2004 law having to do with forgiving debt, applies to this circumstance as well, and that is something a lot of people disagree with, and that's why it's before the Supreme Court.
Right, but you're assuming, again, Robby, that a lot of people disagree with. A lot of people disagree with the PPP loans, but...
I don't disagree that Congress has a right to do it.
Wait a minute. Big moneyed interests didn't get behind saying we're going to strip business owners of this right that's been afforded, this privilege that's been afforded to them by the government. That's the difference between these cases. A law was passed in 2004 that said the government had the authority, and in a case of emergency, to suspend student debt payments
for veterans,
to waive, or I forget the actual language, but to waive or something. And that language is actually important because it's more than just waive. To waive or modify student debt. Because of the emergency. And it's not just extended to veterans, it's broader than that, or else we wouldn't even be sitting here talking about that. So now we're in this situation where the law is being applied, and some people somewhere believe that it shouldn't be because they have decided to make it a political issue. There is a law that was passed, and the question is whether or not the argument that's being made is that this authority is too narrow.
What do you mean it's not a political issue?
I agree that it's a political issue, but it's not an issue of principle. It is not an issue, frankly, so the issue of standing, just to be clear, the way the law works is that we don't believe that just because if you get in an accident, Robby, if you get in, God forbid, a scooter accident, I can't decide, oh, that scooter company was negligent. I don't like that my friend Robby got hurt. I want to sue the big scooter.
Right.
You have to have some relationship to a claim. Right. Otherwise, we could all just be suing all over the place, and people could have these really self-interested, exploitative lawsuits that have nothing to do with any harm they've actually suffered.
I think it would be no, you're adequately summarizing the law. I actually think this is a huge barrier to advocating for human liberty, is not being able to sue the government, which pays for its everything it does based
wait a
on
minute.
confiscating
that's
our
a
money.
Different thing.
Well, you're right.
The barriers to suing the government are different, and I would agree
Way too low.
too high.
The barriers are too high. Yes.
So, but that's a separate issue than.
Well, that's what this is.
No.
This is government redistributing money from people who didn't go to college to people who did.
The government has a special status that is different from people. That prevents it from being sued unless it basically gives you permission to sue.
Right.
And you have to use things like the Alien Torts Claim Act. I don't want to get into all of that. If you want to actually sue the government, if the government has caused you harm. However, this is not one of those instances. The issue here is whether or not the people can sue, whether or not this attenuated plaintiff can sue on behalf of a loan servicer who themselves has not chosen to insert themselves into this case because they are actually harmed. The question is whether or not this person who is not a loan servicer.
Yeah, the standing issue is the main issue in the case.
Right.
I agree.
So, and that's important because when you frame the difference between what's happening here and what's happening with any number of other government grants, let's say the fact that under the Trump administration, we had tax cuts for the rich that went over 85% of which of every dollar went to the top 1% of the earners in this country. Policy after redistributional policy happens to disproportionately flow up to the very, very top, which is no wonder when you look at who it is that's writing our laws and who's in the halls of Congress and how hard they are lobbied and by whom. The point that Randi Weingarten is trying to make there is that why is it that when all of these, every policy is redistributional. The whole government, you can hide it and try to talk around it, but the government's role is to say there's money flowing around this country, there's some people who are haves and have-nots, there's people with inherited wealth, there's people who have nothing. How do we make this country fair? How do we make it so that we don't have people living and dying on the streets? How do you make it so that our elderly aren't suffering? We do redistributional policies. Randi Weingarten's point is why is it that only the redistributional policies that actually go to poor and working people, like these student debt policies, which are going to people who are too poor to afford to pay for college? Why is it only those that are getting challenged in the Supreme Court? And the answer is it's because who has the money, what are the moneyed interests who are willing to push back against those policies versus the others?
The answer is because this is flagrantly unconstitutional and is going to be ruled as such.
It's not flagrantly unconstitutional. The constitutionality of it isn't what's at issue here.
The issue is I agree with you. The standing is the complicating legal issue here is the way it might not succeed, but
right.
Yeah.
Right. And people, you should keep in mind that 45 million Americans have student debt. Joe Biden promised that he would cancel student debt, at least $10,000 of student debt for qualified people. There's an income cap requirement, so this is not something that's impacting the rich. This is a policy. He said he was going to cancel all HBCU student debt, historically black colleges and universities. That also hasn't happened. And student debt advocates have been making this point repeatedly. If he had simply canceled the debt on day one, it wouldn't have given. It would have passed with flying colors. It wouldn't have been an issue because by means testing it, he gave people an opportunity to mount these legal challenges, which they would not have done. The money would have been canceled, and it would have been next to impossible to put.
Which you've argued maybe he did on purpose in order to sabotage it.
I think that maybe he did. I think that maybe he did. And I also think that using this, instead of using the Higher Education Act, using this HEROES Act was also a misstep. Although it seems like during the oral arguments yesterday, there was less focus on whether or not the HEROES Act was inappropriate because we're no longer in a COVID emergency per President Biden himself.
For his own words.
Then there wasn't a standing issue. And people who listened to the hearing, and I probably will talk more about this tomorrow, probably in a radar, but people who listened to the hearing felt as though the focus on the number of standing questions that came from all of the judges, liberal and conservative alike, suggested that many of them had serious problems with the standing problem, and that if they had asked more questions about the other pieces, it would have indicated that they had more of a problem with, say, the use of the HEROES Act as opposed to the standing. So standing is the threshold question that has to be addressed, which is why I think even though I was very skeptical that this was going to make it through the courts, and people that I've talked to on my show, like Professor Jed Sugarman of Fordham Law School, were also very skeptical, saying that even the progressive judges might shoot this down because there's just no there, which is a poorly designed law. It might actually survive because the standing claim is so weak.
Well, in another fervent plea outside the Supreme Court yesterday, Texas Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee somehow managed to bring up the children of Ukraine. Let's listen to this.
I refuse to accept that this great nation, who stands alongside of the Ukrainian people, fighting for democracy around the world, so that the children of Ukraine stolen by Russians can come back to their nation and stand equal under the sun, then I refuse to accept that each and every one of you who are here, families who cannot come to this place today, mothers and fathers who are getting up with a heavy load on their back, taking children to school, trying to make ends meet because they went and accepted the challenge of an American dream and now are under the burden of usurious rates that are slapping them to the ground.
Cancel student debt, it's what the Ukrainians would want. A winning political message.
It's such an odd move. And I was reminded yesterday that Randi Weingarten took a trip to Ukraine last fall, ostensibly to talk about the educational precarity of Ukrainian children.
Maybe to make sure the children were wearing masks. She was the foremost educational advocate of keeping actually schools closed as long as possible. She said on TV that she would prefer there to be 0 COVID cases until schools reopen, something basically no one endorses. So not my favorite actor in the space.
I don't understand that messaging in the least. It feels like a distraction and deflection. And I'm sorry, I think Americans are increasingly frustrated by the feeling that their minor, meager domestic concerns aren't enough on their own without everything having to be folded into some weird domino theory World War II narrative about how we have to save the world and spread democracy.
Yeah, well, we can agree on that. We're pretty far apart on this issue, but on that aspect of it, we agree. We'll have more Rising right after this.